With our last example, we had our LED blinking without using delay. And to show that that was happening, we were writing information to the serial monitor that we could then view on our computer. Now, what would be far more exciting is if we had each of these LEDs blinking at a different rate. And so we're now going to look at how we can modify the same sketch to achieve that. One of the important things as you get into more development of sketches is that it's really tempting sometimes to copy and paste code multiple times if you want to do something multiple times. So if you have 3 LEDs, you're thinking, oh, I'll just take this piece of code, copy it, and then paste it twice, and then make it work that way. And that will work for a while, but eventually you'll get to a point where you get confused about which one you're using, and your file increases in size, and so you lose track of where all the parts of your different sketch are. So a better way is to use loops. And these allow you to do the same thing more than once. And they, when they're combined with something called arrays, then that allows you to do a different thing each time. So let's have a look at how we can change our sketch to work with loops and arrays. So if you think about a variable as like a box that you're putting a piece of information in, and you have to refer to it by its name each time. So if you create another variable, then you're creating another box with another name. But sometimes it's easier to have, say, 3 boxes that all have the same name and then a different number. So like a street address. You might have 1 South Street, 2 South Street, and 3 South Street. So that's like having an array. So we can go ahead and change this from just a variable that will hold 1 item to an array that will hold 3 by simply putting square brackets and then the number of items that we want to store in it. And then on this side, we can also specify the values of the items that are in it. So in this case, we want to have pin 8, we want to have pin 9, and we want to have pin 10. So this says that LED is now an array, LED pin is now an array that holds 3 items. And those 3 items have the value of 8, 9, and 10. So if we look at LED pin 0, for example, then that'll be 8. It's important to remember that the values start at 0, they don't start at 1. So it's like if your street address, the first house on the street was house number 0 and not house 1. That's just the way that computers work sometimes. And so if we want to find out what the value of LED pin 3 is, then we would look at the third item, which in this case will be LED pin 2, because we've started counting at 0 and then 1 and then 2. So the next thing we have to change is that we also want to record the state of each of our 3 LED pins. And so we can again turn the LED state variable into an array simply by saying, actually we're going to be storing 3 items in this, and then give them their initial values of low. So we also, for each of the LEDs, want to store when we last checked the, or last changed the state. So let's add 3 boxes for that as well. And initially, they will all have the same value. But over time, they will each gain a different value as to when the last time the state was changed. And then finally, we want to have a different interval for each of the 3 LEDs, because this is why we're doing it. We want them to blink at different rates. And so to do that, we turn this into an array, which has 3 items. And the first item will keep at 1,000 milliseconds. The second item we want to flash every 500 milliseconds. And then finally, we want the last one to flash really rapidly every 100 milliseconds. So now we have gone through and made our initial setup, and we've changed all of our variables that we need to into arrays. So there's 2 ways of interacting with arrays. One approach is to repeat the same piece of code 3 times. So we can say we need to set these pins to output. So let's put the first the 0th item, the first item, and the last item in the array, take those values and set those pins to outputs. So if we look back here, we can say LED pin, the first item, or the 0th item, is 8. So this will set pin 8 to output. Then for the next item, we're looking at the offset of 1, which is pin 9. So we can then we can see here, this is pin 9. And then finally, we want to look at the third item, which has the offset of 2. And so this is pin 10. And so we're going to set that to an output on this line here. So once we've set it to an output, we can then move on. So this is one approach that you can take with arrays, but it very quickly gets to a point where, again, you've got a lot of copy and pasted code, and so you're kind of defeating the purpose of moving to using arrays in the first place. So what we can use instead is called a for loop. So a for loop we will use when we want to do the same thing multiple times to different items. So in this case, we want to check how long it is since we've last updated an LED, then we want to see how long we're supposed to wait until we update it again, and then we want to store that information and set the correct state. So the piece of code that we're going to be repeating starts here and goes through to there. So we need to modify it so that we can use a for loop. So first of all, we can start our for loop. So it's called a for loop because in your mind you can think of it as for this number of times I want to do this. So the first thing we need to keep track of is the counter. So this keeps track of how many times we've done it. And the first time that we enter the loop, it's going to be 0 because we haven't done it yet. And then we want to think about how many times we want to perform this operation. And we know that we want to perform it 3 times. And so because we've started counting at 0, we want to count and do it when it's 0, when it's 1, and when it's 2. And by that stage, we've reached 3. So we can make this happen by saying, I want to do this loop until as long as the value is less than 3. And then this means that when it hits 2, then it'll do it, but then the next time through the loop, the value will be 3, and it will no longer be trying to do any more operations. And then we say, and each time through the loop, we want to increase the value by 1. And we can do this using the shorthand of plus plus. That just means take the current value and add 1 to it. So then we have curly braces to open it, and then we have to have matching curly braces. You'll notice that the IDE, when we have a closing curly brace, highlights the other one up on this line up here. So when we're up here, it highlights the one down here and vice versa. Now, it's a good habit to get into the habit of keeping the formatting of your sketches nice. So that means that when you have a block, which is what a for loop is, it's a block of code that exists by itself, is to keep it indented by itself. So we can select it and then hit the tab button, and that will indent it nicely for us. So we now have our counter, so let's have a look at the code in our for loop. So we go through and we want to know what the current milliseconds is. That we can just store once each time we go through the loop. Then we want to have a look at the value of the last time we checked for this item. And so this is the first place where we put the counter. So the first time through the loop, this looks at the previous millis array, which is this one here, and looks to see what the 0th item on that is, which in this case is a value of 0. And then we want to check that the difference between that and the current time between whatever the interval is. So in this case, we want to say, okay, what's the value for the interval counter? So in this case, for the first item, we'll go, okay, has 1,000 milliseconds passed since we last checked. And then for the other second item, it'll be, has 500 milliseconds passed. And then for the third item, it'll be, well, has 100 milliseconds passed. And so once we've done that calculation, and we've determined that the interval of time has passed that we want, then we need to store that value so that when we go through and check again that we've got the right value. So we need to store the previous millis, the value in the previous millis array, and set that to the current time. Then we want to see what's the current state of this LED, so we need to look in the array for that. And then once we know what the state is, we want to turn it to the opposite. So if it's low, we want to make it high. So again, we have to store that in the LED state array. And finally, if it's high, then we want to set it low. And then at the bottom of the loop, we want to say, okay, so for this pin that we're looking at, if it's the first one, or the 0th one, the first one, or the second one, then we want to take that pin and we want to set it to its current state. And so we can do that by setting, retrieving it from the LED pin array and retrieving the current value of the LED state. So each time through, this code will be repeated for each of the 3 LEDs. So it will be repeated once for the green LED, once for the red LED, and once for the blue LED. So let's upload that code now and take a look at what it does. So we've got a sketch compiling, and then it uploads. And now we have our 3 LEDs blinking. So the blue LED is blinking really fast, and so that's about 10 times a second. The red LED is blinking twice a second, and the green LED is blinking at once a second. And if we look at our serial monitor, you can also see that it's also sending out those random numbers to the serial monitor at the same time. So you can see that the combination of avoiding using delay and using arrays and for loops is really powerful for controlling multiple independent things.